is a feisty crowd for this early in the morning.
Trust and more. So let's get started. Yes. Education was a huge value for you and your family growing up. When you were a young boy in Indonesia, you had your formal classroom, and then your mother had sort of another version of a classroom for you. How has that influenced you throughout your life?
Well, first of all, it's good to see everybody. And, from my hotel room, I could see the line was really long. I want to say that at first I thought maybe Michelle was speaking. The fact that you guys were waiting in line that long, that's really nice of you. It helps it was in San Diego, because the weather's pretty good out there. Is that we were always working off of probabilities. And I'll take a concrete example. The auto industry bailout.
Yeah.
People don't really remember how bad things were now, but they were really, really bad.
Yep.
And the economy actually was contracting faster than it did during the Great Depression. And we had to make decisions that normally might have been debated over the course of 2 years. We were having to make those decisions in a week or a month to prevent unemployment from going, say, to 25%. One big decision we had to make was what to do with the auto companies that were all flatlining. I mean, they were going bankrupt. And there was a big question about, do we bail out Chrysler? Ford was in pretty good shape. GM was so big that we knew we were going to have to help it restructure. Chrysler was borderline. And at the time, the polls in Michigan said that 90% of people did not want us helping the auto companies. I mean, it was really unpopular. We were able to achieve success despite the fact that there were a whole bunch of things that came up that didn't go exactly according to plan.
In that situation, you were receiving a lot of advice. You had intelligence, your advisors were suggesting things to do. Were they all in agreement?
No.
Okay. So how did you make the decision?
Well, the interesting thing about the presidency, there are a lot of interesting things. One thing that's you discover very quickly is that the only thing that lands on your desk is stuff that doesn't really have a good solution or an answer to it.
Right.
Because if it could be figured out perfectly, somebody else would have already figured it out and not sent it to you. They sent it to you because really smart people for a long time had gone over it and finally said, you know what, we don't know.
Yeah.
You figure it out. Different voices and different perspectives around the table. And when you made a mistake, you would all go around and say, what is it that we could have done better? By the way, we'd have that same evaluation when we had a success. What is it that we did well that that allowed us to achieve what we wanted to achieve? The Bin Laden raid. Everybody knows that iconic picture of us all sitting in the Situation Room and we're watching, seeing how that thing unfolds. That was 6 months of a whole slew of agencies, civilian, military, meticulously planning every element of what was an extraordinary operation. And its success was dependent on the courage of Navy SEALs and incredible intelligence officers and the work that they had done. But it was also achieved because we had a process in which we tested every possible thing that could go wrong. Including, by the way, what happens if the helicopter doesn't work right? Or what happens if the weather changes? And no individual could have figured all that stuff out on their own. But having set up a system in which I insisted on rigor and constantly probing and looking at previous operations that had failed. Most things that are worth doing are hard. If they were easy, everybody else would have done them already. And I always used to tell my daughters sometimes I'd come home after a long day in the Oval Office or the Situation Room, and I'd say to them, girls, I just want you to know, just so you're setting expectations right, adults don't really always know what they're doing. It's amazing a lot of stuff works at all. I'm sure some of you have that experience in your organizations. But the great thing about us humans is that when we work as teams and we're willing to try things and learn from our experiences, then we can achieve extraordinary stuff, even though each of us individually have our blind spots, our flaws. And so one of the things that I think we did very well, again, in the campaigns and in my presidency, was to have an environment in which everybody could constructively contribute to the discussion. Invest in public schools to make sure that every child gets a good education. That our state governments invest in our institutions of higher learning. You take an example like California. Part of the extraordinary growth of California was built on the California university system that was unparalleled. It was a crown jewel and was affordable so that people didn't have huge debt but were able to get an education. Same thing with the GI Bill. So it's important for individual families to emphasize to their kids the importance of education. It's important that our society as a whole reinforce those lessons that families like mine taught me. And Michelle, by the way, would say the same thing. Her parents didn't have a chance to go to college, but both her and her brother were able to go to Princeton, go on to, Michelle went on to Harvard Law School, and that was all because here in America, we believed that your ultimate abilities are not determined by where you're born, to the circumstances in which you find yourself starting off, but rather how hard are you willing to go and beyond. And just the surface elements of getting paid, whatever financial or other benefits are provided on the job. And I'll give you an example of our campaign back in 2007. I mentioned these young people that we gave a lot of responsibility to. We get 22, 23-year-olds who we just send out into some small town in Iowa. And we'd say, go organize them, and you're getting paid 20 grand a year, or whatever. Maybe not that much, I don't know how much we were paying them, but I didn't feel that sorry for them because this is what I had done when I was their age, so I was like, you're fine. But a lot of times these were young people who, let's say they were from a big city, and suddenly they're in some farm community in Iowa, Sometimes they were a minority group. You know, there was a young man who was a Chinese American who was put in a community where, frankly, the first day he was called a chink while he was going door to door. But because he had a set of values, in that circumstance, he was able to set up a little booth outside the supermarket because he knew how to be polite to people and kind to them. And he'd start helping some of the elderly people carry their groceries to their cars while talking to them about Obama, this guy. There were some in my economic team that said, look, just let Chrysler go, it's not going to make it. And then we can play, do triages effectively and prop up the stronger auto companies. There were others who said if we do that, then suppliers and dealers of Chrysler are going to go under, and that is going to bring everybody else down. And it was probably a 51-49 decision. But again, if you set up an honest, transparent, rigorous process where you are hearing all sides of the debate and you're insisting on getting the best information possible, then what I felt confident about when I decided, in fact, we should help Chrysler as well, what I felt confident about was nobody could have made a better decision. It didn't mean that I was making the right decision, but it meant that I had confidence that I'd heard all points of view and had all the data and had all the facts. And that principle, I think, applies to any business, any company, any nonprofit, any government institution. And where I see failures typically is when, because of various institutional biases, ideological preferences, people being scared to bring bad news, you don't get all the information to make the decision. Thanks so much for having me. Thank you. Just like any organization can't work if, for example, we don't insist on facts. Like, facts are really useful because you can't make good decisions if we don't at least agree on the facts. We can all have different opinions, but we have to believe in the same, that this is a table. And so, and I mean this in all seriousness, it is important for us to make sure, regardless of our political proclivities, that the values underlying this great country don't get eroded, because situationally, you know, in this particular circumstance, it's convenient for us to abandon our values to get what we want. But, you know, one of the things that it taught me was to make sure that you're doing something because it's the right thing to do, because you have something in particular to offer, not just because you want to be something. I always say this to young people, White House interns, fellows, others who ask me for advice about living a life of service, and I say to them, worry less about what you want to be, worry more about what you want to do. Because what I mean by that is, in politics, but I think this is true in a lot of fields, people are so obsessed with, I want that title. You know, I want to be a congressman, or I want to have the corner office, or I want this title. and they don't spend enough time thinking, what is it that I'm trying to accomplish? And I think I've fallen into that mindset. It's part of the reason why oftentimes in Washington, people end up becoming congressmen, but they don't know why they want to do it. Or why. My mother, she was able to lead a life of purpose, working overseas to make sure that impoverished women were able to build up small businesses through microfinancing, and she was able to do that because of the education she received. And frankly, I wouldn't be born had it not been for my father, who had grown up in a small village in Africa, getting a scholarship to study here. So everything in our family was based on the ability to, and the confidence that if we applied ourselves, that if we had a society that supported our education and contributed to our ability to access new information and widen our horizons, that we could make something of ourselves and be useful. And that was a value that was instilled in our family, but frankly, it was also a value that existed in America. And one of the things that I always emphasize is that as important as family is, it's also important to have a society that says, you're important enough that we're going to invest in you.
Yeah.
One of the interesting questions is, how do you create an effective system for good feedback and for accurate data, and people, no matter how junior, feeling that they can speak up if they see something that might not be working. What a habit that I developed very early on. In all my meetings, typically you'd have some big fancy table in the cabinet room or the situation room, so all the important personages are sitting. You got the generals and the secretaries and this and that. But usually there's an outer ring. And the outer ring is where the people who actually did the work are sitting, right? So they've got all the memos and the briefing books, and they're sitting there, thumbing through stuff that they're handing to the principals, who then start speaking. And I just made a habit in our meetings, especially if there were hard decisions to be made. I'd start calling on the folks on the outer circle. Even though a lot of times I didn't know their names, but I'd be like, you over there. You look like you've got a bunch of stuff you're going through here. What do you think? And they get very nervous. They'd be like, huh? What? But what that transmitted to them was that they had to be on their toes and be prepared, because I wanted to know what they thought. I thought their opinions were important. I was also sending a message to the principals that they should be listening to their staffs and asking for feedback and being open.
With the young people that you're coaching?
Yes. And that's a culture that you have to build inside your organization. And it starts from the top. I am very proud of the fact that from the start of my campaign all the way through the end of my presidency, we consistently were able to take 22-year-olds or 25-year-olds who normally would not have been given a lot of responsibility, and gave them enormous responsibility, and they consistently performed. And the reason was because we had set up a structure that was predisposed to the potential and the power of the people we were working with, that said, we're going to give you a lot of responsibility, we're going to hold you accountable for performing, and to create an environment in which it's less important who gets the credit than what gets done. That we expect you to operate effectively as a team, that we don't have a lot of drama, that you're here for the right reasons, that you treat each other with respect, kindness, and generosity. And what we consistently found was that young people responded to that. They felt a sense that they were part of something bigger. That kind of culture doesn't mean you're always going to get things right. But what it does mean is that you're in the best position possible to both make good decisions, work the probabilities in your favor, and to learn quickly when you do make a mistake.
In your book,
A compass to guide their actions and their decisions. And so what I say to young people is, look, what is it that you're passionate about? If you care deeply about the environment, and you think that maybe politics is one way to have an impact, that's great, but spend most of your time working right now on the thing that you care about. If there's a way for you on a local level to influence issues like climate change. There are ways locally for you to make sure that kids get a good education, or that people who are homeless have shelter. And if you're doing those things every day that are actually meaningful to you, then over time you will find yourself achieving and rising into positions of more and more influence because you've learned to do what you care about really well. And that's true in business as well. When I talk to people like Bill Gates, they didn't set off saying, I want to be a gazillionaire. What they started off is saying, this computer thing's really interesting to me and I want to create some software. I want to create the best software. And their passion in the work then leads them to achieve extraordinary things, and as a byproduct, they end up being gazillionaires. But I tell you, look, like Michelle, I didn't come from a wealthy background, and all we really had was education. And my grandfather grew up in a small town in Kansas, and there you go, Kansas continued. And he was able to, after World War II, come back on the GI Bill, and that's how he got his education. Somebody made an investment in him. My grandmother, because at the time, even though she was working on a bomber assembly line during the war, didn't get a GI Bill benefit. One of the changes we made when I was president was to make sure that spouses and family members of our veterans also got it. So she never had a chance to go to college, although she was able to work her way up from the secretarial pool to become a vice president of the bank. When I get worried about our country or the world, it is not around a particular issue. Any given tax policy, I might have a point of view, a political opponent might have a different point of view. That's okay, that's how democracy is supposed to work. A particular position on some environmental regulation, we can argue about that. I worry when our values are not being upheld. short-term thinking, which, by the way, has happened on both sides of the political aisle on occasion. That kind of short-term thinking carries grave consequences, because democracy is not something that happens automatically. It is something that has to be nurtured and practiced. And our kids do watch what we do. And so if they see that, you know what, adults aren't honest, or they make excuses, or they try to get out of stuff, or they distort things, or so on and so forth. Over time, we'll pay a price for that. Didn't feel as if they were just a cog in the machine. We welcomed their ideas, we welcomed their input. We had high expectations of them. People respond when you expect a lot of them.
You also created an environment where it was okay to fail.
Absolutely. It was okay to fail as long as you learned from it.
Exactly. Yes. It's a very important
If you failed and then you made excuses or you tried to cover up that you screwed up, then it wasn't okay.
Resilience. Most of us have had times in our career that cause us to pause and to reflect. In 2000, you ran for Congress, but didn't quite win.
Oh, I got whooped.
What did you learn from that, and how did it change you going forward?
Well, it is true that this is the only political loss that I suffered during my career. Tony was being very nice. I mean, I just got smashed. I got hammered. The story is that I was in the state legislature, had a young family. I was feeling a little impatient. I thought I could take on the local congressman, who was also a Democrat, who I thought wasn't performing up to snuff, and so I said, let me go ahead and run. And I had my staff in the state legislature just do a kind of an informal poll, and they came back and they said, yeah, Barack, we think this is going to be great. People seem to really like you. I announced, and then we did one of those formal, really professional polls, and it turned out that only like 11% of the people actually knew who I was. So somehow we had randomly only called by accident people who liked me. So that was a good lesson. Always do the poll before you announce that you're going to run. On one of the community bulletin boards that said the Little League team needed a coach. And so he volunteered because he had played high school baseball, and he became the Little League coach in this town.
Oh my gosh.
And by the end of this process, he could have been elected mayor. I mean, people loved him, and so I showed up at this town for a rally, and there's like 1,000 people, and everybody's like, "Oh, we love Ronnie," and they're cheering, and some of the moms who like cooked for him, and and like were crying when they saw him upstage with him. And the point I'm making is that he had. Here was a young Asian American kid from LA who had never been on a farm in his life, who's now suddenly in a rural community in Iowa that was largely conservative. This wasn't a predominantly Democratic area. The reason he had been successful was not because of my 10-point plan for dealing with healthcare or economics. The reason was because he was in possession of a set of values that he had carried into that situation, transmitted to him by his parents, about sticking to it, about being respectful to people, about being helpful, about being open-minded, about not being discouraged. And all those things had carried over to make him successful. Hello, everybody. This is a feisty crowd for this early in the morning.